He is a staff writer at The Atlantic and author of The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, American Evangelicals in an Age of Extremism. Tim, Alberta. Tim. How are you, sir? Good to meet you. It's been a while. We've wanted you here, and now you're here. And of course, we're at that point in the election season where we start breaking down the electorate into the subgroups and who will control the election, and it is all about that. So it's a good time for you to be here to talk about evangelicals, because that is always a very important group. And of course, the white evangelicals break huge for Trump, right? What is it this year, over 80%?
Yeah, that's what we expect.
Okay. And look, we could do the obvious. Why do they support the least religious man in the world, the most immoral man? I've done that. She's remembering some of the things I said about it in the years past. Yeah, I mean, that's boring to me because I did that editorial in 2017. I want to know, what do the evangelicals must see a bigger picture than we see in Donald Trump? What is that?
Look, I think, Bill, there is a persecution complex at work here that may seem silly and overblown to a lot of people from the outside looking in, right? But for folks inside the church who believe that the country is slipping away from them, that they no longer recognize the Christian America of their youth, and they believe that Donald Trump is an imperfect vessel for God's perfect will. And they look at him and say, well, the barbarians are at the gates. Maybe we need a barbarian to protect us. And I think in many ways, there's almost a mercenary relationship here where Donald Trump's bad behavior almost reinforces their support, because they look at him and say, well, no good Christian man is capable of protecting us in the way that he is, right? And so in a way, it almost liberates him to behave badly and to say whatever he wants, and sort of just creates this this ongoing relationship where whatever he says and does, his support remains steadfast.
He's the badass gunfighter who they give him the badge to be the sheriff, even though they know who he is, or he's Cyrus. I've heard that comparison. Can you explain that one to us? Who is Cyrus in the Bible?
Yeah, Cyrus is the Old Testament Persian king who allows the Jews to go back and rebuild the temple, right? And the idea being that he's not one of them, but he protects them. And that Trump, in his own way, although certainly you do have a subset of these folks who believe that Trump actually is a Christian, that he had a born-again experience in the White House, that Mike Pence led him to Jesus in the White House. Which would make the events of January 6th. I mean, if someone had led me to Christ, I feel like I'd probably try to help them if they were, in danger at the Capitol, but set that aside. But most folks, I think, are pretty clear-eyed about who Trump is. They're not under any illusions about him being a, Bible school, Sunday school Bible reading guy. It's just that they view him as someone who's capable of protecting them from a culture that has slipped away in a country that they don't recognize anymore.
Right, and they do, I mean, you said persecution complex. That is part and parcel to Christianity. There is no Christianity without that. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And of course, Christ himself suffered and all that. They love to suffer. They like that. And the fact that they're not so much under siege as they're losing customers. Each generation gets less and less religious. You're welcome. But my question is, as we get less and less Christian, I think the country is 65% Christian. The Republican representation in Congress, 99%. Even the Democrats, 78%. How do you explain that?
Well, look, I think it's important to distinguish real persecution from manufactured persecution, right? So you have Christians all around the world, in China, in India, in sub-Saharan Africa, who could never conceive of having political power, of cultural influence, of any sort of privileged status conferred upon them because of their faith affiliation. And in some way, that helps the Christian movement in these areas to thrive and to be sort of organically strong and authentic. And when you look at the American church, it's obviously a very different story, in part because privilege and status and power is all we've ever known. And so now when you see the demographics beginning to shift, slowly, but they are shifting, and when you look at the prospect of what does a post-Christian America look like, what does it represent, I think to a lot of these folks here in the white evangelical movement, certainly the world that I came out of, they perceive it as a very real threat to them. And they're desperate to sort of hold on to what they have. But I think the story of Christianity, to your point, is about real persecution and how your faith is strong enough in the face of whatever those challenges are to persevere. But we are at a stage now where we're sort of manufacturing these threats in order to justify the ways in which we treat people who are not us.
And manufacturing the history itself of this country. I mean, this is one of the things I thought was so great about your book, which is very compelling on this subject, all of it, but especially on the idea that they really have it almost the exact opposite. And they've been doing this for years about how this country was founded, a Christian nation. I mean, you know, and they will say it outrightly now. They didn't used to say it quite outrightly as they do. The Speaker of the House, you know, separation of church and state is a misnomer, he says. Lauren Boebert, I'm tired of this separation of church and state junk. It is the very foundation of this country. It's the most prevalent thing that makes this country different. We were founded by people who wanted to get away from religious dogmatism. That's what the Pilgrims were.
Well, Lauren Boebert also said, rather famously, that Jesus didn't have enough AR-15s to keep the Roman government from killing him. That's a real thing that a real member of Congress said. I'm not making this up.
Oh, I know.
So you do suspect at a certain point that some of these people use evangelical or use Christian more as a sort of cultural identity than a, doctrinal, theological identity. Setting that to the side, what you're saying here is really at the root of our problems. Everyone has a different definition for Christian nationalism, and that's part of the problem because we don't know exactly how to define it. To me, Christian nationalism is really just the marriage of bad history and bad theology, and one is a prerequisite for the other. Once you've gone around to the school boards and the legislatures, once you have changed the curriculum, once you have rewritten history, literally rewritten the history books to convince people that in fact this was born to be a Christian nation, that in fact the Establishment Clause and the First Amendment, that those things were sort of an elaborate three-dimensional wink and nod from the founders, that they really did want for us to be an explicitly Christian nation governed by European Christian men, and that they were fine with an eventual theocratic takeover of our governing institutions. Bill, once you get to that place where you accept that piece of history as being true, then suddenly the way that you read scripture is very different, and it becomes very easy for you to distort basic theology, the ways in which Jesus commands us to look forward to a kingdom that is not of this world. You begin to think that actually that kingdom is in this world, that it is here, it is now.
But you believe in that kingdom of the other world. I mean, you talk about get to a place where you can't believe people believe this. That's what I think about you, quite frankly.
Oh.
But anybody who's still, I don't understand how you could write this book, and also I know you were brought up in an evangelical house.
Yeah.
I was also brought up as a Catholic, believe me, I put in my time. They also drilled mercury into my teeth when I was a child. But I had both things drilled out of my head. How do you maintain that sort of cognitive dissonance that you can criticize them so logically, but you still believe in the central, what I would call myth?
Well, a couple of things. First, C.S. Lewis wrote that the only reason we can recognize a crooked line is because we've seen a straight line first, right? So the criticisms we have of Christianity institutionally, I think, can be quite easily divorced from a sort of clear-eyed look at the historical figure of Jesus of Nazareth and to understand who he was, what he represented in the context of his time.
But that's different than but you believe him as a god.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, I
Yes.
think he was probably a historical figure.
Well, but once you've crossed that threshold, once you've come to believe that he is indeed a historical figure, you can either believe that he was a madman and a maniac and the worst sort of liar who would pretend to be God. You can view him as someone who was vile and contemptible historically, or you can view him as exactly who he said he was, but there's really no in-between.
Oh, come on. There's plenty of in-between. I can view him as a guy who lived then. He could have been a little nutty. Sometimes nuts have manifestos that make some sense. The Unabomber made some good points.
Well,
mean, and by the way, this is what Thomas Jefferson and a few other people did. They took all the miracles and the bullshit out of the Bible. They just wanted to give us Jesus as a moral philosopher, which I'm on that page. He was revolutionary. The meek shall inherit the earth. This was new stuff, okay? And very often noble and admirable. That doesn't mean I have to accept that a dove flew down and banged his mom. And he was born of this virgin and then died and went up to heaven. And, you know, that I can separate those two, no?
Well, it doesn't mean that you have to accept anything. I think...
But why can't I accept one? Why can't I have just column A, moral philosopher, not God, B?
Well, you know, Tim Keller, the pastor theologian who passed about a year ago, he preached a sermon once on this, talking about how if you were to just view Jesus as a moral example, then you'd be missing the entire point. That in fact, only when you view him as a mediator and as ultimately a substitute for you and for your own depravity, for your own brokenness. And Bill, I understand fully that you and others here, that may sound crazy, right? That it's speaking a different language.
It's not, I mean, we're all crazy, Jim.
Well, some of us are not.
We're all crazy in our own way. Anyway, it's a great book. Thank you for coming. I could talk about this all night with you, but I gotta go to the panel. Please thank Tim Alberta. All right, let's